A sunken road turned into slaughterhouse was Bloody Lane at Antietam on September 17, 1862, when Union forces attacked Confederate position, occupying Farm Road, whose banks provided natural fortification against frontal assault. Union attackers face fortified position, where Confederates had positioned themselves behind roads embankments that created ready-made trenches, offering protection while exposing attackers to devastating fire across open ground. With no cover on approaches to Sunken Road, where wheat fields and cornfields had been trampled flat by earlier fighting, Union infantry advanced across terrain, offering no concealment from Confederate riflemen who could fire from protected positions. No elevation giving attackers any advantage over defenders positioned in road cut below field level, paradoxically making defenders' lower position advantageous because embankments shielded them while attackers were fully exposed. No escape once assault was committed because retreating across open ground was as dangerous as advancing. Union soldiers trapped between Confederate fire from front and orders preventing retreat without authorization from officers. Casualty rate over 55% in some regiments reflected devastating effectiveness of Confederate defensive fire against exposed attackers who could not effectively return fire while advancing across open ground toward entrenched enemies. In some units whose losses exceeded half their strength within minutes of beginning assault, survivors describing advance as walking into hurricane of lead where falling was only question of when rather than if. Survival odds near zero for soldiers in front ranks who faced heaviest fire and who had no protection except bodies of fallen comrades who were shot down before reaching Confederate positions. Near zero mathematically when casualty rates exceeded 50%, and when some companies were virtually annihilated before reaching Sunken Road, where Confederates maintained devastating fire until their position was finally flanked by Union forces attacking from different angle. The corpses that held up next wave, literally as Union soldiers used bodies of fallen comrades as improvised cover while attempting to maintain assault on Confederate positions in Bloody Lane. Bodies piled 2 and 3 deep in places where multiple Union assault waves had advanced across same ground and where dead from earlier attacks had not been cleared before subsequent waves were ordered forward into same killing zone. 3 deep in some locations, where Union casualties accumulated faster than bodies could be removed, creating macabre obstacles that following soldiers climbed over or sheltered behind while attempting to advance toward Confederate lines. Men drown in ditch in their own blood when wounded soldiers fell into Sunken Road after Confederate position was overrun, their injuries causing blood loss that pooled in road's low points, where wounded men who could not move drowned in mixture of blood and rainwater. The road becomes Red River, as accumulating blood literally flowed along Sunken Road's length, survivors describing seeing road's bottom covered in blood deep enough to flow like water. Red River was not metaphorical exaggeration but literal description of Sunken Road filled with blood from thousands of casualties concentrated in small space, making Bloody Lane name grimly appropriate for site of slaughter. One of most statistically lethal engagements of entire war when measuring casualties per acre or per hour, Bloody Lane's concentrated killing exceeded even larger battles, whose total casualties were higher, but whose deaths were distributed across larger areas and longer time periods. Of entire war in terms of intensity, if not total numbers, engagement at Bloody Lane, representing peak of Civil War's killing efficiency, when massed infantry fire against exposed attackers produced casualty rates that soldiers on both sides found horrifying even by war's brutal standards, making Bloody Lane legendary as place where survival seemed impossible, yet where some men somehow lived through experience that killed most of their comrades. 12,500 men, sent into perfect kill zone, was Pickett's charge at Gettysburg on July 3, 1863, when Confederate forces attempted frontal assault across mile of open ground against entrenched Union position. A mile-wide march across terrain offering minimal cover exposed Confederate infantry to sustained fire from Union artillery and rifles for duration of advance that took nearly 30 minutes from start to contact with Union lines. Toward 150 cannons positioned on Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill, whose overlapping fields of fire covered entire width of Confederate advance, Union artillery beginning bombardment with solid shot at long range, then switching to canister as Confederates closed distance. And thousands of rifles held by Union infantry positioned behind stone walls and earthworks on Cemetery Ridge, their defensive advantages in cover and elevation making them nearly invulnerable, while Confederate attackers were completely exposed. Survival odds for front ranks less than 1% based on casualty statistics, showing that forward Confederate units were virtually annihilated before reaching Union positions, soldiers in leading formations facing longest exposure to Union fire and absorbing heaviest casualties. Less than 1% reflected mathematical reality, that almost no soldiers in front Confederate ranks survived unwounded to reach Union stone wall at attack's climax, their destruction clearing path for following waves who faced slightly better odds through walking over bodies of comrades who had absorbed some of Union's defensive fire. Into perfect kill zone designed by terrain and Union defensive preparations to maximize Confederate casualties while minimizing Union losses, Cemetery Ridge position allowing Union forces to concentrate fire on predictable Confederate approach route. Perfect in military sense because Union position exploited every tactical advantage, while Confederate attack plan negated Confederate strengths in individual combat skill by requiring them to advance across open ground where Union firepower could be employed most effectively against massed formations that could not maneuver to avoid fire or seek cover during advance toward Union lines. The high water mark of death was point where Pickett's charge reached Union stone wall on Cemetery Ridge before being repulsed. Confederate penetration of Union line lasting only minutes before survivors were killed, captured, or driven back. Entire companies vanish in sense that unit cohesion dissolved completely when casualties exceeded 50% and when surviving soldiers either surrendered or retreated individually rather than maintaining formation discipline. Vanish from roles as organized units because casualties were so severe that regiments and companies ceased to exist as functional military organizations, their survivors being absorbed into other units or being too few for reconstituting original formations. Officers fall as if scythe passed through them, according to Union observers who watched Confederate officers leading advance, being shot down systematically by Union marksmen, targeting men on horseback or men carrying swords and wearing distinctive uniforms identifying them as officers. Passed through their ranks, cutting down leaders disproportionately because officers' visibility made them priority targets and because their insistence on leading from front exposed them to heaviest fire. A Confederate major later writes in memoir that his premonition during advance was certainty of death rather than hope of victory, his description capturing psychological reality that most participants understood they were marching toward probable death. "We weren't marching to victory but to execution," expressed Confederate recognition that assault plan was fundamentally flawed and that reaching Union position would require surviving fire that mathematical probabilities suggested was unsurvivable for most attackers. To execution characterized survivors' retrospective understanding that Pickett's charge was sacrifice rather than viable tactical operation. Confederate soldiers having been ordered to attempt what tactical situation made nearly impossible when Union defensive advantages in position, firepower, and numbers made successful assault improbable, regardless of Confederate courage or tactical skill shown during advance toward Union lines that ended in retreat after brief penetration, demonstrated futility of continuing attack. The 20th Maine's suicidal stand occurred at Little Round Top on July 2, 1863, when regiment was positioned at extreme left of Union line, defending Critical Hill, whose loss would have compromised entire Union defensive position at Gettysburg. Outnumbered 4-1 by Confederate forces attacking uphill toward 20th Maine positions, numerical disadvantage, making defensive situation desperate when reinforcements were unavailable because Union forces were fully committed elsewhere on battlefield. Low on ammunition after repelling multiple Confederate assaults, soldiers rationing remaining cartridges, and recognizing that continued defense would soon become impossible once ammunition was completely exhausted. At far end of Union line, where 20th Maine represented last organized unit between Confederate attackers and undefended Union flank, regiment's position, making their defense essential for preventing Confederate breakthrough that would have compromised entire Union left wing. If they break, entire army collapses was understanding that motivated 20th Maine's desperate defense, despite casualties and ammunition shortage that should have forced retreat. Soldiers, recognizing that their position's loss would create disaster exceeding cost of holding against overwhelming odds. Entire army's fate, depending on single regiment's ability to hold position, reflected tactical situation, where 20th Maine occupied critical anchor point that Confederate forces were attacking precisely because they recognized its importance is less than #0. 9 is greater than collapses if Little Round Top falls to Confederate assault that would have allowed Confederate artillery to enfilade Union positions along Cemetery Ridge, making Union defensive line untenable and forcing retreat that might have become rout. Suicidal characterized 20th Maine's tactical situation, where holding position required accepting casualties that would destroy regiment as effective fighting force, but where retreating would produce consequences worse than regiment's destruction, making sacrifice necessary for Union Army's survival, even when survival odds for individual soldiers appeared minimal, given Confederate numerical superiority, and given ammunition shortage that made sustained defense impossible through conventional means. Fighting with stones, bayonets, and bare hands occurred when 20th Maine exhausted ammunition and resorted to improvised weapons during final Confederate assault on Little Round Top. Casualty rate nearly 40% in under hour reflected intensity of combat, where 20th Maine absorbed Confederate assaults through firepower, initially, then through hand-to-hand combat after ammunition was depleted, losses mounting rapidly as soldiers fought at close quarters. In under hour from beginning of Confederate attacks on Little Round Top to their final repulse after 20th Maine's bayonet charge, concentrated fighting, producing casualties faster than most Civil War engagements where battles typically lasted hours or days, rather than being decided in single hour of intense combat. Nearly 40% of 20th Maine's strength becoming casualties demonstrated cost of holding position against numerically superior attackers, losses that would have destroyed most units' cohesion, but that 20th Maine absorbed while maintaining defensive integrity. The defense holds by sheer desperation, when ammunition exhaustion forced Commander Joshua Chamberlain to order bayonet charge downhill into advancing Confederates. Counterattack's psychological shock, combined with momentum of downhill charge breaking Confederate assault at moment when Union defense seemed about to collapse. By sheer desperation rather than through superior numbers or firepower, 20th Maine's survival resulting from willingness to attempt desperate bayonet charge when conventional defensive tactics had been exhausted along with ammunition. Survival is mathematical insult to reality. When examining casualties, ammunition shortage, numerical disadvantage, and tactical situation that suggested 20th Maine should have been overrun by Confederate forces, whose attacks should have succeeded once Union ammunition was exhausted, to reality that military logic suggested should have produced Confederate breakthrough rather than Union defensive success. 20th Maine's survival and their successful defense of Little Round Top defying probability calculations that indicated Confederate numerical superiority should have overwhelmed Union position once firepower advantage was eliminated through ammunition exhaustion, forcing hand-to-hand combat, where Confederate numbers should have been decisive. The explosion that became Death Trap was Battle of Crater at Petersburg on July 30, 1864, when Union forces detonated mine containing 8,000 pounds of gunpowder beneath Confederate fortifications. Union miners blow 170-foot hole under Confederate trenches through tunnel, extending over 500 feet from Union lines. Explosion, creating crater 30 feet deep and 170 feet long, while killing approximately 300 Confederate soldiers, instantly. Under trenches where Confederates had established defensive positions protecting Petersburg, mines detonation destroying section of Confederate line and creating opportunity for Union breakthrough if assault forces could exploit gap before Confederates recovered from shock and reorganized defenses. But troops charge into crater instead of around it due to poor leadership and confusion, assault plan, having called for troops to move around craters' edges rather than descending into hole where they would be trapped below ground level. Instead of following plan to advance beyond crater and exploit breakthrough in Confederate line, Union troops descended into crater where they became trapped when Confederate forces rallied and established positions on crater's rim. Around it would have allowed Union forces to exploit gap in Confederate defenses, advancing into Petersburg before Confederates could reorganize. But actual Union movement into crater turned opportunity into disaster. Into crater, creating tactical situation where Union soldiers were trapped below ground level, facing Confederate forces firing down into hole from protected positions on rim, terrain advantages completely reversing from favoring Union to favoring Confederates once assault forces descended into crater. Death trap emerged when Confederate counterattack established positions surrounding crater, trapping Union forces who could not climb crater's steep walls under fire, while Confederate soldiers fired down into packed mass of Union troops with near-perfect target-rich environment, making every shot likely to hit someone in crowded crater below. A pit with 60% kill rate was crater at Petersburg, where Union casualties exceeded 3,000 from force of approximately 15,000 engaged, concentrated killing in confined space, producing casualty rate higher than most Civil War battles. Crossfires from Confederate positions surrounding crater rim created situation where Union soldiers trapped below were exposed to fire from multiple directions simultaneously, making cover impossible and making every location in crater vulnerable to fire from some Confederate position. Grenades thrown or rolled into crater by Confederate soldiers who did not need to expose themselves to danger while attacking trapped Union forces below, improvised explosives and artillery shells being dropped into crater where they exploded among packed Union troops. Bayonets used in hand-to-hand combat when Confederate soldiers descended into crater or when Union soldiers attempted to climb walls and encountered Confederates defending rim, close quarters fighting, adding to casualties from gunfire and explosives. Suffocation affected soldiers trapped at crater's bottom, where bodies piled up and where smoke from gunfire concentrated in depression without adequate ventilation. Some Union soldiers dying from inability to breathe rather than from wounds. Nowhere to hide in crater whose walls offered no protection from fire originating above. Union soldiers' attempts to dig shelters into crater walls being ineffective when Confederate positions on rim commanded entire interior. Some units suffer near total annihilation, with casualty rates approaching 90% in formations that had advanced deepest into crater and that could not retreat when Confederate counterattack sealed exits. The crater becomes mass grave as Union retreat left hundreds of dead in hole that had promised breakthrough, but that became trap killing thousands of Union soldiers through combination of Confederate fire, explosions, and suffocation in confined space where escape was impossible once Confederate forces established control of crater's rim and prevented Union survivors from climbing out. A pocket of Union troops surrounded by thousands was Hornets' Nest at Shiloh on April 6, 1862, when Union forces under Benjamin Prentiss established defensive position in sunken road and timber that Confederate attacks could not dislodge despite overwhelming numerical superiority. The Hornets' Nest becomes kill chamber as Confederates unleash massed artillery after infantry assaults failed to break Union defensive line. Confederate commanders, concentrating dozens of cannons on small area where Union troops were entrenched. Becomes deadly confined space, where Union soldiers faced sustained artillery bombardment that they could not effectively counter because their position lacked artillery and because Confederate guns were positioned beyond effective rifle range. Kill chamber in sense that Confederate artillery fire made Hornets' Nest area deadly killing zone, where survival depended more on luck than on tactical skill, when shells were exploding continuously among packed Union defensive positions. As Confederates recognized that frontal assaults were too costly and that artillery bombardment offered method for destroying Union position without suffering infantry casualties comparable to what earlier assault attempts had cost. Unleash massed fire from approximately 60 cannons concentrated on Hornets' Nest position, Confederate artillery employment exceeding typical battlefield concentrations and creating bombardment intensity that Union soldiers had not previously experienced. Massed artillery, whose concentration on small area created killing efficiency, rarely achieved in Civil War battles, where artillery was typically dispersed along battle lines rather than being concentrated on single position. Confederate decision to mass guns against Hornets' Nest, demonstrating recognition that conventional infantry assaults could not dislodge determined defenders holding good position. Artillery bombardment continued for hours while Confederate forces surrounded Hornets' Nest, cutting off retreat and forcing eventual Union surrender when ammunition was exhausted and when continued resistance seemed futile against overwhelming Confederate numbers that had isolated Union position from rest of Union Army. Survival rate, almost impossible, characterized Hornets' Nest, where Union forces held position for hours against repeated Confederate assaults and sustained artillery bombardment before being forced to surrender. After hours of non-stop fire from Confederate artillery and infantry attempting to overrun Union positions, casualties accumulated rapidly among defenders who lacked cover adequate for protecting against concentrated bombardment. Over 7,000 casualties fall in single sunken path and surrounding timber where Hornets' Nest fighting was concentrated, number including both Union defenders and Confederate attackers who were killed or wounded during day-long struggle for position. In single area whose relatively small size made casualty concentration higher than in larger battles where dead and wounded were distributed across miles of battlefield rather than being concentrated in small defensive position. Survivors describe hearing bullets like angry bees, creating buzzing sound that gave Hornets' Nest its name, the volume of fire being so intense that air was filled with sounds of passing bullets and of impacts against trees and ground. Like angry bees was apt comparison for sound environment, where thousands of bullets per minute were being fired by both sides, creating constant buzzing punctuated by explosions and screams. Thousands per minute of firing rate when calculating Confederate artillery and musketry, combined with Union defensive fire, combined volume of shooting creating sound and physical environment that survivors found difficult to describe adequately to people who had not experienced comparable intensity. Survival odds being minimal when calculating probability of individual soldier avoiding being hit during hours of exposure to thousands of bullets and artillery shells being fired into confined area. Hornets' Nest defense being remembered as example of position where holding seemed impossible, yet where Union forces maintained resistance for crucial hours that allowed rest of Union Army to establish defensive line preventing complete Confederate victory at Shiloh, despite tactical defeat in Hornets' Nest sector. Grant's most devastating 20 minutes occurred at Cold Harbor on June 3, 1864, when Union forces launched frontal assault against fortified Confederate positions protecting approaches to Richmond. Union forces ordered to charge fortified Confederate line, whose defensive preparations included earthworks, abatis obstacles, and carefully positioned artillery, creating overlapping fields of fire covering all approach routes. Across open ground offering minimal cover where Union infantry would be exposed to Confederate fire for hundreds of yards before reaching defensive works, terrain advantages strongly favoring defenders who could fire from protected positions. Some units suffer 90% casualties before firing single shot because Confederate defensive fire was so effective that Union soldiers were shot down during approach before closing to range where their rifles could effectively return fire against entrenched Confederates. Before firing shot demonstrated that assault was fundamentally flawed when attackers were destroyed before they could engage defenders effectively, casualties resulting entirely from Confederate defensive fire rather than from mutual combat, where both sides inflicted losses. 90% casualty rate in some forward units meant virtual annihilation of formations that led assault, their destruction occurring so rapidly that following units could see futility of continuing attack before they were committed. Most devastating because casualty rate and speed of Union defeat exceeded even other costly Union assaults during overland campaign. Cold Harbor representing nadir of Grant's tactical decision-making when he ordered assault against position that reconnaissance should have revealed was too strong for frontal attack to succeed. 20 minutes from assault, beginning to its effective end, when surviving Union soldiers sought cover and refused to continue advancing despite orders. Veterans, recognizing that continuing attack meant certain death without reasonable prospect of achieving breakthrough that might justify casualties being suffered in futile assault against impregnable Confederate defensive positions. Men pin their names to their coats before Cold Harbor assault in recognition that casualties would be so severe that identifying bodies would be difficult without some method for distinguishing dead from units that would suffer near total losses. Survivors write names on scraps of paper or cloth that they pin to uniforms so bodies could be identified after battle, practice demonstrating soldiers' certainty that they would die during assault. On scraps, using whatever writing materials were available, soldiers creating improvised identification tags because official identification systems were inadequate, and because soldiers recognized that conventional methods for identifying dead would be overwhelmed by casualties that Cold Harbor assault would produce. So, bodies could be identified by burial details that would collect dead after battle, soldiers' preparation for death, reflecting their accurate assessment of survival odds when attacking fortified Confederate positions across open ground. Can be identified after deaths that soldiers expected with near certainty based on their combat experience, allowing them to assess tactical situation and to recognize that assault plan was suicidal when terrain and Confederate defensive preparations made successful attack virtually impossible. The ultimate admission that they expect to die characterized soldiers' preparation of identification before battle, their actions demonstrating that morale had deteriorated to point where veterans no longer believed in mission success, but were attacking anyway due to military discipline. That they expect to die rather than hope to survive reflected realistic assessment of tactical situation where even successful assault would cost most attackers lives, and where failure seemed more probable than success when Confederate defensive advantages were obvious to soldiers ordered to attack. Expect meant near certainty rather than mere possibility, veterans' combat experience allowing them to calculate survival odds that they understood were minimal when attacking. Prepared Confederate positions whose strength had been demonstrated through repulsing earlier Union probes, unsuccessfully. Hood sends 20,000 men into Wall of Rifles at Franklin on November 30, 1864, when Confederate forces attacked entrenched Union position in frontal assault, as tactically flawed as Pickett's charge, but involving larger numbers. A frontal assault as hopeless as Gettysburg charge because Union defensive position at Franklin offered same advantages in cover, elevation, and concentrated firepower that had destroyed Pickett's forces. Confederate attack plan repeating tactical errors that had failed catastrophically at Gettysburg. But larger in numbers engaged and in frontage attacked, Franklin assault involving approximately 20,000 Confederate soldiers attacking across 2 miles of open ground toward Union earthworks, defended by comparable Union numbers in fortified positions. As hopeless because tactical situation favored defenders as strongly as Cemetery Ridge had favored Union at Gettysburg, Confederate attackers facing same combination of open ground approach, fortified defenders, and overlapping fields of fire that had made Pickett's charge fail. Confederate officers call it purest madness of war in their post-battle assessments, recognizing that assault plan ignored tactical realities favoring defense, and that attack had been ordered despite officers' objections that frontal assault against fortified position would produce catastrophic casualties without reasonable prospect of success. Purest madness characterized officers' view that Franklin assault was tactically unjustifiable, even by aggressive Confederate tactical standards that normally favored offensive action, attack being so obviously flawed that even aggressive commanders recognized its futility. Of war suggested that Franklin represented peak of tactical recklessness when Confederate Commander John Bell Hood ordered assault that his subordinate officers believed was suicidal, but that they attempted anyway due to military discipline, requiring them to execute orders regardless of their professional judgment that attack would fail. Into Wall of Union rifles positioned behind earthworks whose defensive fire would devastate Confederate formations attempting to cross open ground, metaphorical wall being created by concentrated Union firepower that would be directed against predictable Confederate approach routes. The night Army of Tennessee died was Franklin's aftermath, when Confederate casualties were so severe that Army ceased to function as effective military organization, despite nominally remaining in field for few more weeks. 14 Confederate generals killed or wounded demonstrated that officer casualties were proportionally higher than enlisted casualties because generals led assaults personally and because their visibility made them priority targets. Killed or wounded representing over half of Confederate division and brigade commanders engaged at Franklin, leadership losses that could not be replaced and that crippled Army's command structure for future operations. Survival odds for some brigades less than 5% when calculating casualties against engaged strength. Confederate units that penetrated deepest into Union position, suffering near total annihilation when they were cut off and surrounded. Less than 5% meant that 19 of 20 soldiers became casualties in some formations, virtually complete destruction of units, whose assaults succeeded tactically in breaching Union line, but who could not hold position without support that was not available. Franklin ends entire army through combination of casualties exceeding 6,000 Confederates killed, wounded, or captured, and through destruction of command structure when general officer casualties eliminated experienced leadership. In 5 hours from assault beginning at approximately 4 p.m. to darkness ending fighting around 9 p.m., concentrated combat producing casualties faster than almost any comparable Civil War battle. Entire army died in sense that Army of Tennessee never recovered combat effectiveness after Franklin casualties and leadership losses, subsequent operations being conducted by demoralized and depleted force that bore little resemblance to confident army that had attacked at Franklin, believing aggressive tactics could overcome Union defensive advantages that actually proved insurmountable despite Confederate courage during assault that achieved temporary breakthrough before being repulsed with catastrophic losses. The mathematics of courage and oblivion characterize 7 battles where survival odds approached 0, yet where some soldiers survived through combination of factors that statistics alone could not explain. These battles weren't won by tactics or genius in sense that tactical brilliance determined outcomes, instead results being determined by firepower, defensive positions, and soldiers' willingness to continue fighting despite horrific casualties. Or genius, but by willingness to endure casualties that would have broken less determined forces, neither side demonstrating tactical innovation that compensated for fundamental reality that massed firepower against exposed infantry produced predictable casualty rates. They were survived through luck determining which individual soldiers were hit and which somehow avoided being struck despite being exposed to same fire, killing their comrades. Through chaos of battles where outcomes were determined partly by unpredictable factors like timing of Confederate counterattacks or arrival of Union reinforcements at critical moments. Stubbornness of soldiers who continued fighting after rational calculation suggested retreat was only sensible response to tactical situations where success seemed impossible. And human will sustaining resistance when material factors suggested collapse was inevitable, determination to hold positions or to continue attacks despite casualties, demonstrating that psychological factors sometimes overcame physical reality of overwhelming enemy firepower. In places where survival rate was 0.001% mathematically, when calculating casualties against engaged forces, men kept fighting anyway, despite understanding that they would probably die. And in end, that impossible endurance reshaped nation through determining which side could sustain combat, despite casualty rates that would have ended wars in previous eras when smaller losses forced peace negotiations. Civil war continuing partly because both sides demonstrated willingness to accept casualties that earlier generations would have considered unbearable, reshaped through proving that democracy could survive existential test requiring sustained sacrifice. Union victory resulting partly from ability to replace casualties and to maintain public support, despite losses that Confederate states could not match, making endurance as important as tactics in determining war's outcome. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.